السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I'm available. Okay, just 1 minute.
Okay, take your time, Doctor, please.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله دكتور.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
كيف الأحوال؟
شكرا لحضرتك للحضور. إذا مستعد دكتور حتى نبلش بإذن الله تعالى.
Yes, yes, please. I'm ready.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome.
Good evening.
Today's webinar. I am Mr. Salam Abbas, the head of the Department of English at the College of Education for Human Sciences at المثنى University, and I'll be chairing this meeting along with Dr. Khuzai. She's a lecturer also in our Department of English at المثنى University. On behalf of the Department of English, I am delighted to introduce the Associate Professor Dr. Almanna from Hamad bin Khalifa University. He is a series editor of Routledge Studies in Arabic Translation, London, New York, Routledge. He obtained his PhD in Translation Studies from the University of Durham, UK, and his MA in Translation Studies from Westminster University, UK. Currently, he is an Associate Professor of Translation Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar, where he teaches and supervises MA and PhD students. In addition to many articles published in peer-reviewed journals, he is author, editor, and translator of several publications. His recent publications include the Routledge course in Translation Annotation, Semantic for Translation Studies, the Nuts and Bolts of Arabic Translation, the Arabic English Translator as Photographer, Reframing Realities Through Translation, and Translation as a Set of Frames. These translations and publications are published in Oxford and Routledge, etc. Before we start our webinar, please, we have a few tips. At the time of our guest starts presenting, all participants are in a listen-only mood, so please mute your microphones. I would kindly ask all the participants not to keep writing any information about themselves. Just enjoy listening to the lecture and take notes. Regarding the registration form, it will be uploaded at the end of this meeting. You will have the opportunity to ask the questions during the question and answer period. There will be a participation certificate for the registered participants, and finally, have you all an enjoyable time. Thank you very much. And the microphone now is for Dr. Almanna to start his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Salam Al-Musawi. Actually, it is my pleasure to be with you tonight to talk about my own approach to translating tenses from Arabic to English. Before starting, just let me double check the quality of my voice. Is it okay?
Yeah, it is very okay for me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Before for joining us, thank you very much.
Yeah, before starting, I would like to seize this opportunity with both hands to thank first Mr. Salam Abbas Al-Musawi, the head of the English department at Al-Muthana University in Iraq. And also, I would like to thank you all for making this happen, for making this possible. So thanks a lot, the attendees, my colleagues, and my students. Actually, let me tell you something before starting. Let me tell you something about this webinar, this particular webinar. Actually, it is a dream come true for me, because we discussed the idea of having a lecture, a seminar, or workshop, Mr. Salam and me, 2 years ago imagine 2 years ago, but we failed due to the COVID-19. Therefore, when I was invited, I didn't hesitate. I didn't drag my feet. I didn't say, let me think about it, or let me reflect on it, or let me give it a second thought. No, I accepted this wonderful invitation with pleasure and without any hesitation. So now let's get started. So
Thank you very much, Dr.
yeah,
Almanna,
it is my pleasure,
accepting
actually.
our invitation. Thank you very much. Thank you
It
very
is my
much.
pleasure. It is my pleasure, yeah. And I will start my presentation with this simple question. Is it easy to translate tenses from Arabic to English or from English to Arabic? Is it easy to translate tenses, because we talk about tenses, from Arabic to English or the other way around? Let me answer that question on your behalf. Actually, it is easy to translate tenses from English to Arabic, but it is a hard nut to crack when you are asked to translate tenses from Arabic to English. So why do we have that difficulty? The question that might be raised here in this respect, why do we have that difficulty? Actually, this is because in Arabic, we don't have a grammatical category for what is called aspect, but we have a grammatical category for what is called tense. But in English, they have two grammatical categories for both tense and aspect. That's why they have 12 combinations of tense and aspect. Actually, it is wrong to say they have 12 tenses, because they are not tenses. They are combinations of tense and aspect. Therefore, when we translate from Arabic to English, we face that difficulty. Okay, so now let's move. I have already said that Arabic has a grammatical category for what is called tense. So let's move to talk about tenses in Arabic. Actually, tenses in Arabic, according to Arab grammarians, are classified into three main types. ما بني لما مضى, past. ما بني لما هو كائن ولم ينقطع, present. And ما بني لما يكون ولم يقع, order. And by the way, order has a futuristic element of, you see, it has a reference to the future. That's why sometimes they classify tenses into past, present, and the future. Now, let me share my slides with you. And while we are waiting for the slides to pop up, let me thank you again for giving me this opportunity to be with you tonight. Actually, it is my pleasure. Can you see the slides, Mr. Salam?
Yes, Doctor, they are clear.
Yeah.
Yes.
So before moving to talk about tenses in Arabic, we need to be clear about certain terms and words, such as tense and aspect. So what is tense? What is aspect? What is the difference between them? Actually, both of them refer to time. So what is the difference there? Tense, to begin with, refers to when an action, an activity, a situation occurs, while aspect refers to how that action, that activity, that situation occurs. So when we talk about tenses, we try to do our best to highlight the word when. But when we talk about aspects, we try to highlight the word how. So we have already mentioned that Arabic has a grammatical category for tense only. We don't have a grammatical category for aspect. Now let's move to talk about tenses in Arabic, of course. So as can be observed, tenses in Arabic can be classified into three main types. ما بني لما مضى, we talk about past. ما بني لما هو كائن ولم ينقطع, we talk about present. and ما بني لما يكون ولم يقع. Here we talk about order, and order, I think you agree with me, has a reference to the future. Okay, with this in mind, tenses in Arabic can be classified into two main types. Those tenses which are part of reality, and those tenses which are not part of reality, but rather part of irreality. So about present, actually present is singing in between reality and irreality, because if we concentrate on the three main portions of any activity, of any situation, initial, medial, and final. So when we talk about present, okay, at least one of those portions occurs in the past, while others will occur in the future. That's why it is swinging between those which are part of reality and those which are part of a reality. Now, let me read something in Arabic, and then I will summarize what is written here. Just let me. Okay. يقول سيبويه أن الفعل يؤخذ من لفظ أحداث الأسماء ويكون على ثلاثة أنواع: ما بني لما مضى past, ما بني لما هو كائن ولم ينقطع present, and ما بني لما يكون ولم يقع order. ويقول ابن يعيش أن الأفعال مساوقة للزمان، والزمان من مقومات الأفعال، توجد عند وجوده وتنعدم عند عدمه، لذا فإنها أي الأفعال تقسم إلى ثلاثة أنواع: ماض وحاضر ومستقبل. وهذا التقسيم يحاكي تقسيم الازمنه التي هي حركات الفلك، فمنها حركه مضت وحركه لم تاتي بعد، ومنها حركه تفصل بين الماضيه والاتيه. Here we talk about present when I said it is swinging between past and future. لذا يبدو من كلام سيبويه والسرافي وابن يعيش والنحاة البصريين كلهم ووافقهم فيما بعد الكوفيون أن النحاة متفقون على أمرين. They had an agreement about two issues. First, they classify tenses into three main types: past, present, and future or order. Second, they concentrate on the form of the verb. In other words, they study those tenses morphologically by concentrating on the form of the verb. Having said that, just let me move to another slide. Having said that, it is worth mentioning that the Arab grammarians were in the loop about the problems related to such a classification based on the form of the verb. Actually, they were fully aware of these problems related to such a classification when we concentrate on the form of the verb. Therefore, they suggested that those tenses should be studied from two different perspectives. The first one, which is called a morphological perspective, منظور صرفي, and the second one, which is called a grammatical perspective, منظور نحوي. Okay, to make what I have in my mind clear, let's consider this example. Let's analyze it together. Let's concentrate on the verb اتصل. We have two sentences. اتصل عليك صديقك أمس ولم يجدك. Now, let's try to do our best to identify the morphological tense by concentrating on the form of the verb. اتصل. So it is not يتصل or اتصل or سيتصل. Therefore, it is what? It is past, morphologically speaking. What about the second sentence? إذا اتصلت, again, we have اتصلت. So it is past, morphologically speaking. Therefore, if you rely, this is my own opinion, if you rely as a translator on the morphological tense, you will fail to translate accurately. You will fail to create a similar mental image in the mind of the target language reader. Why? Because this perspective, okay, fails to support you to translate accurately. Therefore, the Arab grammarians suggested another perspective, which is called the grammatical perspective. Now, let's adopt that perspective to identify the grammatical tenses in these two sentences. اتصل عليك صديقك أمس ولم يجدك. Here, by virtue of the word أمس, by virtue of ولم يجدك. So when we adopt that grammatical perspective, the structure itself should be given a front seat. The structure should be given full consideration, adequate consideration. Therefore, the grammatical tense of the first sentence, when we concentrate on اتصل, is past two. Therefore, we don't have any problem when we deal with the first sentence. Okay, your friend called you, okay, yesterday, and he couldn't, or he didn't, better than couldn't, he didn't find you. Of course, if you take into consideration the social factors and social dimensions, formality, distance, solidarity, you might go for another translation, such as your friend gave you a bus, which is informal, yesterday, but he didn't find you. You see? Now let's move to the second sentence. We said, if you remember, the morphological tense is past, اتصل. It is not يتصل or سيتصل. But if you take into consideration the structure, إذا اتصلت بي في مثل هذا الوقت ثانية فسأخبر والدك بالأمر. So here it has a reference to the future. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره. So we have somehow similar structure. Therefore, the Arab grammarians were fully aware of this problem. That's why they suggested that we need to adopt what they call a grammatical perspective in order to, let's say, translate accurately. Okay, now let's move to discuss another sentence to see if you are still in favor of this perspective or no. So let's have a look at those four sentences with the same grammatical form. لم أزره, لم أزره, لم أزره, لم أزره. Now, the question that might be raised here, can you capitalize on the grammatical perspective? Can you cash in on that perspective? The answer is no. Why? Because let me do it step by step. Let me start with the morphological tense by concentrating on the form of the verb. So let's zoom in on the verb azr. So here, azr, the tense is a present, morphologically speaking. Azr, present, azr, present, azr, present. And we said this perspective, I mean the morphological perspective, is of little help. It will not take you to, and it will not take you to the accurate translation. It will not take you too far. And if you try your luck and flip a coin, cut your cards, and translate by relying on the morphological tense, you might succeed, you might not. So it is a sort of a leap in the dark, قفزة في الظلام. You see, therefore you need to rely on the grammatical perspective by taking into consideration the whole structure, by paying extra attention to the structure. But with this example, we failed to translate accurately. I think you agree with me. لم أزره أمس، لم أزره من أمس، منذ أمس، مذ أمس، لم أزره لغاية أمس، لم أزره قط. Can you please translate them into English by activating what I call the mechanism of equivalent search and write your own translation on a piece of paper. We can discuss it later. So here, the grammatical perspective that we were happy with fails to support, thus leaving us in the lurch, holding the bag. So what is the solution then? Actually, we need another classification. Here is the solution. This is my own classification. I normally classify tenses in Arabic into three main types: morphological tense, زمن الصيغة أو الزمن الصرفي; structural tense, زمن التركيب; and contextual tense, زمن السياق. So, as a translator, you have to do your best to figure out the contextual tense if you want to translate accurately, if you want to create a similar mental image in the mind of the target language reader. Okay, now please have a look at those 4 sentences and try to translate them. Let me just drink some water. So, لم أزره أمس. Now let's figure out the contextual tense. By the way, it is not easy to figure out the contextual tense, but I will provide you with some steps, some notions, some categories that can be used to help you to figure out the contextual tense. لم أزره أمس, by virtue of أمس, we talk about what? We talk about something occurred yesterday. So the emphasis is placed on the completion of the act of not visiting somebody yesterday. Therefore, the contextual tense is past too. What about لم أزره منذ أمس? Here, the emphasis, this is one of the points that I'm going to emphasize later, which I call the point of emphasis. You need to figure out the point of emphasis in order to figure out the contextual tense, and then you translate accurately. So لم أزره منذ أمس, here by virtue of منذ أمس, we don't talk about yesterday, but rather we talk about the whole period that started yesterday and is still relevant to another point in the present. So we talk about the whole period. We are able to identify, look at that, this is the second point. We are able to identify the starting point yesterday. Okay? Here, when we talk about the state of boundedness, this is another issue that I'm going to discuss with you. Now, let's move to لم أزره لغاية أمس. لم أزره لغاية أمس or لم أزره حتى أمس. Again, we don't talk about yesterday, but rather we talk about the whole period that started in the past and specified because we are not able to determine the starting point. And it's relevant to another point in the past, specified yesterday. So now, activate, please, the mechanism of equivalent search and try to translate. Here, when I ask you to activate the mechanism of equivalent search, I assume that you have a good linguistic competence, which is part of your own translation competence. Translation competence covers a lot of sub-competences. One of them, and the most important one, is the linguistic competence. When we talk about the linguistic competence of a translator, we talk about 8 skills instead of 4. 4 skills in the source language and 4 skills in the target language. That's when we have 8. So here we assume that you have a good linguistic competence. That's when we ask you to activate the mechanism of equivalent search. So it seems that we have two steps. First, you need to identify the contextual tense, and then immediately after that, you need to activate the mechanism of equivalent search. Then you translate. لم أزره قط. Here, by virtue of قط, again, we talk about the whole period that started in the past. Can you determine, look at that question, can you determine the starting point? The answer is no. You see? So it doesn't have a left-hand boundary when we talk about the state of boundedness later. And it's relevant to another point in the present. So we talk about the whole period that started in the past, and it's relevant to another point in the present. Please activate the mechanism of equivalent search. How would you translate this sentence? We are going to discuss it later in our discussion. So this is my own model to translate that can be used by you as a translator, as a translation teacher, as a translation student to translate tenses from Arabic to English. No, the other way around. Because if you remember, we said earlier that we don't have any problem to translate from English to Arabic, but we have a difficulty to translate from Arabic to English. So we have 4 steps. The first step, and the most difficult one, is that you need to identify the contextual tense. So the question that might bear its ugly head here, how can we identify the contextual tense? Are there certain steps? Yes. I'm going to discuss them with you in a minute. Then, after that, you activate the mechanism of equivalent search. Here, I have already mentioned that. We assume that you have a good linguistic competence. Otherwise, you cannot translate. Okay? And then you move to the act of translating. When you finish your own translation, please don't submit it somewhere. Don't submit it to your teacher. Don't submit it to the company. Try to back translate, just to double check, just to evaluate your own translation. You see? So it seems that we have 4 steps. Now, let's go back to the question raised earlier. How can we identify the contextual tense? Are there certain steps? Yes. We have 8 steps. The first step, and the most important one, and I guess you are familiar with that step. I call it point of emphasis, which refers to whether the emphasis is placed on the frequency of the action as a matter of routine, the duration of the action, the continuity of the action, and so on and so forth. So you need to figure out the emphasis, whether it is put on the continuity of the act, of the action, or no, something else. The second one, which is called plexity. Here, we talk about the quantity of the action, typically expressed by the verb. So it refers to the quantity of the action, whether it is made up of one element or more than one element. We need examples to make what I have in my mind clear. We are going to discuss some examples, don't worry. The third one, extent of causation. Here, we talk about, okay, it refers to the action, okay, it refers whether the action is part of reality, ما بني لما مضى, or part of a reality, ما بني لما يكون ولم يقع, or in between, present. You see? The third one or the fourth one is the pace of events, which refers to whether the pace of events is sped up or slowed down. Number 5, time lapse, also known as time gap, which refers to whether there's a time gap, a time lapse between two actions among many actions. Okay, this also should be given a front seat. State of dividedness. You see, here we talk about the internal segmentations of the quantity. In other words, we talk about whether the action has breaks, interruptions, gaps or not. And next one is called state of boundedness, whether the action has boundaries, left-hand boundary, right-hand boundary, or no. See, and the last one is called degree of extension, which refers to whether the action is reduced to be seen as a point on the timeline or no. It is drawn out over a short period of time, over a long period of time. So you see, so you can use all those categories. You can rely on one. So those categories can be used individually or collectively, depending on the example at hand. Now, let's have some examples just to make this point clear. Look at these 3 sentences with the same grammatical form. ما زال يزور أصدقائه في هذه الأثناء. ما زال يزور أصدقائه منذ ساعة. ما زال يزور أصدقائه منذ سنوات. So you are kindly asked to have a look at these 3 sentences. Try to do your best to translate them by figuring out the contextual tense. And then we can discuss your own translation later if we have time. Okay. Let me start with the first point, the first notion, the first category, which is called the point of emphasis. So ما زال يزور أصدقائه في هذه الأثناء, by virtue of the grammatical form, by virtue of the content specifications, the emphasis is placed on the continuity of the act of visiting. The act of visiting is drawn out over a short period of time when we talk about the degree of extension. So the act of visiting and the process of doing to go terms from holiday is drawn out over a period of time. And the emphasis is put on the continuity of the act of visiting. In terms of quantity, if you remember, when we talked about plexity, we said it refers to the quantity of the action, whether it is made up of one element or more than one element. In terms of quantity, here in the first sentence, the act of visiting is characterized by uniplexity because it is made up of one element, one visit. We talk about one act of visiting. Is that clear? Yeah. So am I making my point across? You feel me, right? Okay. So you see, we discuss some of those notions. And are you able, as a language user, as a native speaker of Arabic or a native speaker of English, but you have, let's say, good linguistic competence in Arabic, are you able to determine whether, are you able to determine the starting point of the act of visiting? ما زال يزور أصدقائه في هذه الأثناء. Actually, I'm talking about myself now. I'm not able to determine the starting point. I'm able to determine the end point? No. Therefore, the act of visiting has no boundaries. So it is characterized by being unbounded when we talk about the state of boundedness. Now, with this in mind, now activate what? The mechanism of equivalent search. So you might go for what? ما زال يزور أصدقائه في هذه الأثناء. Is still visiting his friends. Of course, as a translator, you have the right to get rid of still. Also, you have the right to get rid of the equivalent of في هذه الأثناء. You can say he is visiting his friends. By doing so, we can have an example of level shift to plural terms from cart food, 1965. Why? Because we translated certain lexical items ما زال في هذه الأثناء into a grammatical category. You see, he is visiting. But you have the right, because of the differences between the interfacing languages. Of course, you have the right to keep them. Now, let's move to the second sentence. ما زال يزور أصدقائه منذ ساعة من ساعة. By virtue of منذ ساعة, the emphasis, the point of emphasis, the emphasis is placed on the whole period that started in the past. Are you able to determine the starting point? The answer is yes. So we have a left-hand poetry. And it's relevant to another point in the present. Okay? And by virtue of ما زال, we have another point of emphasis where more emphasis is placed on the continuity of the act of visiting. So it seems that we have 2 points of emphasis. We try to emphasize the whole period that started in the past and is relevant to another point in the present, plus the continuity of the act of visiting. Now, activate the mechanism of equivalent search. You might go forward. He has been visiting his friends for an hour. Now, in terms of quantity, the act of visiting in the second sentence is characterized by unipluxity because we talk about one act of visiting. It is drawn out over a period of time, but it is a short period of time. It might be longer than the one in the first example, might be shorter, we are not sure. But it is for sure, it is drawn out over a period of time, a short period of time, because we talk about hours, not years. See, so this is the degree of extension. And the act of visiting has, in the second example, has no interruptions, no breaks. ما زال يزور أصدقائه منذ ساعة. Why? Because we have one act of visiting. But what about the third sentence? ما زال يزور أصدقائه منذ سنوات. Are we talking about one act of visiting? The answer is no. We talk about a series of acts of visiting. Logically speaking, you visit your friends and you go back home. And then you visit them and then you go back home. Therefore, the act of visiting in the third sentence is characterized by having interruptions, by having breaks and gaps. This means it is characterized by multiplicity when we discuss the quantity of the action, whether it is made up of one element, one act of visiting, or more than one act of visiting. Actually, in the third example, it is made up of more than one element, more than one act of visiting. So with this in mind, you might go for, he has been visiting his friends for years. But what about What about translation of the following kind? He used to visiting his friends. Here, you change the mental image slightly by putting more emphasis on the habituality. So what do you think about this translation? Please reflect on that. Now, we have another example, just to make this point clear. كنت أشاهد التلفاز عندما جاء صديقي البارحة ليزورني. كنت أشاهد التلفاز عندما كنت صغيرا. We have the same grammatical form. كنت أشاهد التلفاز. So we need what? We need before setting the wheels in motion, before translating, we need to figure out the contextual tense. Otherwise, I have already mentioned that if you try to rely on the morphological tense, كنت أشاهد, or the structural tense, كنت أشاهد, you might succeed, you might not. So it is a leap in the dark. So try to do your best to figure out the contextual tense. So let's start with the first sentence. Let's analyze it together. كنت أشاهد التلفاز عندما جاء صديقي البارحة ليزورني. Here, in terms of quantity, we talk about one act of watching. So the act of watching in the process of behaving is characterized by unipluxity because we talk about one act. The act of watching is drawn out over a short period of time. Okay. Are you able to determine the start point and the end point? Then read. كنت أشاهد التلفاز عندما جاء صديقي البارحة ليزورني. Actually, I'm not able to determine neither the starting point nor the end point. Therefore, the act of watching, the process of behaving, is characterized by being unbounded. Why? Because it doesn't have boundaries. Okay? And also the act of watching in the first sentence has no breaks, no interruptions, thus being characterized, okay, by internally continuous. When we talk about the internal segmentation of the quantity, if you remember. So you need to do your best. I have already said you can rely on one, also you can rely on more than one to figure out the contextual tense. What about the point of emphasis? Actually, the emphasis in the first sentence is placed on the continuity of the act of watching in the past. So now activate the mechanism of equivalent search and translate. So you might go forward. كنت أشاهد التلفاز. I was watching TV when my friend came to visit me last night. Now, if you go for the same structure and dealing with the second sentence, I was watching TV when I was young, you're going to fail to create a similar mental image in the target language reader's mind. You're going to fail to translate accurately. Why? Because you adopted a morphological perspective or a grammatical perspective. But what you need to do, you need to figure out the contextual tense. Now, let's analyze the second sentence together. كنت أشاهد التلفاز عندما كنت صغيرا. By the effect of عندما كنت صغيرا, the act of watching is drawn out over a period of time. Over a long period of time. We talk about years. So this means you watch and you take a break. You watch and you take a break. Therefore, we talk about more than one element. So the act of watching in the second sentence is characterized by multiplicity when we talk about the quantity. Why? Because we talk about more than one act. And it is also characterized by having interruptions, breaks, gaps. Therefore, it is not internally continuous, but rather it is internally discrete when we talk about the internal segmentations of the quantity. So now, try to translate, try to activate the mechanism of equivalent search. So depending on your linguistic competence, depending on your translation competence, you might go for, I used to watch TV when I was young. I used to watch TV, thus emphasizing the habituality in the past. Now, let's discuss some authentic examples taken from my own article that I have already submitted to a well-known journal titled A Configurational System-Based Approach to Translating Tenses from Arabic to English. If we have time, we can discuss 3. If we don't have time, we can discuss just 1 or 2. So here, let's concentrate on صناعتها. قام من سجوده وأدخل يده في الجراب فتناول بلغة أجلكم الله means نعم من أجمل البلاغات وأحسنها وأبدعها ولعلها من أروع البلاغات التي صنعتها. If you rely on the morphological tense, صنع, the morphological tense is past. So when you translate, you might succeed, you might know. If you rely on the structure, again, you might succeed, you might know. But what you need to give the context adequate consideration. So the translators, Husni and Newman, okay, opted for had ever been made. Okay, التي صنعتها مدينة فاس منذ تاريخ تأسيسها إلى اليوم. By virtue of منذ تاريخ تأسيسها إلى اليوم, we talk about the whole period that started in the past and is relevant to another point in the past. Therefore, the translators have managed to figure out the contextual tense and have managed to activate the mechanism of equivalent search and have managed to translate this sentence accurately. Of course, we have an example of modulation. If we were terms from Van and Almanna, 1958, because in the source text, it is in the active, while in the target text, it is in the passive. It is also an example of structure shift to plural terms from Cartford, 1965, but I think they have managed to reflect the contextual tense. Let's have another example, just to speed up. قال الشيخ سعيد وهو يرمي في وعاء جمري هتفا من البخور. قال الشيخ سعيد, we have 2 processes here. Process of saying expressed by the verb قال, and the act of saying occurred, I think you agree with me, occurred in the past in the middle of the act of throwing. So the act of throwing in the original text is drawn out over a short period of time. And the act of throwing in the source text is characterized by multiplicity when we discuss the quantity of the action. You throw, and then again, you take something, and then you throw it. You see? So it is characterized by multiplicity. And it is also characterized by having interruptions and breaks when we discuss the state of dividedness. And look at the translation here, he threw and said. So the act of throwing in the process of doing occurred shortly before the act of processing. And the act of throwing is reduced to be seen as a point on the timeline. Why? Because the emphasis is placed on the completion of the act of throwing. Do I have time to discuss the last example, or shall I stop, Mr. Salam?
Yes, please, go on, Doctor.
Yeah, please. The last example that I would like to discuss with you. وأبعد الشيخ سعيد يده عن عزيزة ومضى يقرأ ويرمي. يقرأ ويرمي. Again, let's concentrate on the act of throwing, which is characterized by multiplicity, and also it is characterized by having interruptions and breaks. While in the target text, look at their own translation, he continued his reading, which is good, comma, added. They change the verb to throw, to add, and they have the right because they have taken into consideration the differences between the two languages. But here today we try to discuss tenses, but they found to figure out the contextual tense, thus failing to translate accurately. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Mr. Sam.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Almanna, for such amazing explanation. And it's time now to receive the questions if you have.
Excuse me, Mr. Salam, I would like also to thank Dr. Ali for such an interesting and inspiring lecture. And thank you to Mr. Salam enabling us to see such a wonderful lecture and join so many expertise around our Iraqi universities to attend such a, let's say, an inspiring webinar. Thank you for both of you, Mr. Salam and Dr. Ali. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your effort, Doctor.
Thank you. I think Dr. Shaba from the
Sir, I have a question, please.
Yes, please. Oh, sorry.
Sir, I have a question. We are concerning problems and the numbers of tenses here. You know, actually, grammarian are different in terms of numbers of tenses. How many tenses do we have in English, please? And
actually, yes. Let me answer that question and then move on.
Yes, my second question.
Yeah, just let me answer that question and then
yes,
you can shoot me with the second question.
Yes, sir.
We have all over the world, okay, regardless of the language, we have everywhere, we have three tenses. Okay, three tenses. Regardless, please let me answer that question and then one by one, please. Try to mute yourself and thank you for your cooperation. So regardless of the grammatical categories, but normally in any language we have three references, okay, past, present, and future. Therefore in English we have three tenses. Some grammarians say we have only two tenses, okay, but it doesn't matter. But because they have another grammatical category which is called aspect,
exactly, sir.
They have 12 combinations of tense and aspect. If you add the passive and then you might have more. But normally you have three tenses for me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Excuse me, Dr. Ali, please, dear participants, if you have a question, please raise hand before opening or switching the mic, and then I'll call your names. Yes, I think it's time for Dr. Karim, please.
Assalamu alaikum.
Hello.
I'm Dr. Karim from Howard Medical University. Thank you for Dr. Ali for a nice presentation about translation. We are, as a scientific specialty, medical specialty, sometimes we need translation in the scientific journal. My question is about, can we use the online translation for that? Sometimes we have another journal, for example, in France, translated to English. So we sometimes we use the translation online it is available for that or not? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. If you, may I answer, Mr. Salam?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah,
Dr.
please. So yes, actually, I'm working on a piece of research by using four machines: Systran, Google Translate, Reverso, and the last one I cannot remember. I tried to insert different sentences with different tenses from Arabic to English, and I discovered that they have done a great job, with the exception of two issues. First, the perfect perspective. Not all these sentences, some sentences such as when you have لغاية أمس, لغاية السنة الماضية. So they failed to translate. In addition to that, also, if you use conjunctions such as ما حتى ما, for example, ما أنهيت مشروعا حتى بدأت العمل على مشروع آخر, they fail to deal with the conjunction rather than tenses. So my piece of advice is that you need to make some pre-transferring adjustment.
Yeah.
Okay, rewrite the sentence in Arabic.
Yeah.
Before translating or before using the machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for this question. Mr. Mustafa Al-Hassan, please.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Ali Almanna for this valuable and useful lecture. Actually, I have something to say concerning the example provided by Dr. Ali, which is ما زال يزور أصدقاء, with different context, of course. This example, Dr. Ali said that the concerning plexity, it is uniplex because it occurs in one action when we are talking about the quantity of the events.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Mustafa.
Yes,
which sentence? No, just 1 second, please. To be with
but
you.
I said that it is multiplex, so it depends on the context. Yes.
No, I mean, which sentence? Because we have 3 sentences, the first one, the second one, or the third one.
Sorry, Doctor?
Which sentence? Because I provided you with the 3 sentences.
ما زال يزور أصدقائه في هذا.
Okay. Yes, clear. So you said it is characterized by multiplexity. Is that correct? Are you? May I answer, Mr. Salam?
Yes, Doctor. Go on.
Yeah,
Go on.
please. Yeah, I think Dr. Mustafa said that in the first sentence, can you please, you are kindly asked to mute yourself in order to concentrate on our sentences, and also I can hear you in a good way. Thank you. So in the first example, I will repeat the example. ما زال يزور أصدقائه في هذه الأثناء. It is characterized by uniplexity. Okay, it is not multiplexity. Why? Because we talk about one act of visiting. So it is not multiplexity. But when we move to the third example, ما زال يزور أصدقائه منذ سنوات. Yes, it is characterized by multiplexity. Why? Because you cannot visit your friend and you stay there forever. You have to visit them and then you go back home and then you decide to go there to visit them. Therefore, it is characterized by multiplexity, the third example, but the first example, no. It is characterized by uniplexity. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and thanks for Dr. Mustafa.
Doctor, can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Yes, please.
Yes, I want to say or give you an example related to the contextual representation of multiplicity. When I say, for example, I cut my finger, this is uniplex. But when I say I cut the trees, this is multiplex.
No, cut the trees, Dr. Mustafa. We need to distinguish. So, may I speak, Mr. Salam? Yeah.
Doctor, yes,
Mustafa, yeah, Mr. Mustafa, we need to distinguish between two things when we talk about the imaging systems. First, the matter, typically expressed by noun phrases. So in your example, when you say cut trees, you try to lay more emphasis on trees. You see? Therefore, the act of cutting is characterized by multiplicity. I do agree with you. Also, we need to what? We need to talk about the actions, because when we talk about the quantity, we can talk about the quantity of actions, typically expressed by verbs, and the quantity of matters, typically expressed by noun phrases. But in your own example, you try to lay more emphasis on the noun phrase trees rather than the act. Okay? You can discuss that example by concentrating on the degree of extension as one of the categories of the first imaging system. But I couldn't hear the second example because of the quality of the voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Dr. Mustafa, for this question. Anwar Abbas, please, can ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Ali for his valuable and wonderful lecture. And Dr. Ali, you started the session by questioning whether it is hard to translate from Arabic to English. And you already give us many causes and many reasons why it is. But my question is that, can we say translating from English to Arabic is as hard to translate from Arabic to English?
Thank you, Ms. Anwar, for this question. Actually, your question is not very accurate because I think you talk about translation in general. But what I said, well, we translate tenses from Arabic to English. Is hard not. No, generally speaking, depending on, we cannot generalize, depending on your own linguistic competence in the language. But we have excellent translators who are able to translate only into Arabic, while we have other translators who are able to translate into English, although they are not native speakers of English, but they have what? They have developed a good linguistic competence in the target language. So it depends. It depends on the person. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for answering my
you,
question.
Ms.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking this question. Thank you very much. Now with Mr. Abbas Talib, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really yes. I would like to thank you for this amazing webinar, Dr. Ali Al-Manna. I haven't enjoyed such a webinar, for years. But my question is that, Doctor, through the examples that you have mentioned, لم أزره منذ لم أزره لغاية. Okay, does this suggest that when the verb and the adverb coexist in the same sentence, the interpretation is most likely to be get from the adverb? Because, there is a claim that Arabic language lacks tense. And there are many examples in which, we depend on the adverb rather than the verb when interpreting sentences. And yes, so this is my question, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Abbas. Yes, actually, to a certain degree, you can rely on the adverbs. But if you remember my own examples when I said لا يزال or ما زال, يزور أصدقائه منذ ساعة and ما زال يزور أصدقائه منذ سنوات. The contextual tense is in these two sentences is different. Although we have the same grammatical form, we have the same word منذ. And if you go to كنت أشاهد التلفاز عندما، كنت أشاهد التلفاز عندما. Okay, we have the same grammatical form. So to a certain degree, yes, let's say 90% yes, but I mean, to be sure, to make sure that you are translating accurately, you need to figure out the contextual tense. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and thanks for Mr. Abbas. Now it is the turn for Dr. Hasib, please.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I am obliged to speak Arabic, excuse me.
Yeah, please.
أولا شكرا جزيلا للدكتور علي المناع، والشكر الجزيل أيضا للدكتور سامي محمود على سلام محمود العفو على ما تفضلتم به. Probably I am an special case because I got my PhD from Paris and I taught translation for 38 years in the University of Mosul. So the translation is from French into Arabic and from Arabic into French. مشكلتنا الحقيقة بالفرنسي أصعب بكثير من اللغة الإنجليزية. أولاً الملاحظة الأولى اللي تفضل بها أستاذ علي، دكتور علي، حضرتك تكلمت حول التنس and the aspect. احنا باللغة الفرنسية التنس هو الزمن، الاسبكت هي الصيغة. يعني نقربها شوية للغة الإنجليزية، إذا كان عندنا present simple or past simple، الباست هو زمن، لكن continuous هو aspect.
Yes.
عندنا present هو مضارع، لكن هذا زمن. لكن من نقول present continuous هون أصبح عندنا الاسبكت اللي هي الكونتينيوتي اللي تفضلت بها. هاي النقطة الأولى. احنا بالنسبة للترجمة من اللغة الفرنسية إلى العربي أو حتى من الإنجليزي إلى اللغة العربية صعبة، لوجود 3 أزمنة رئيسية في اللغة العربية، مقابل الحقيقة بالإنجليزي ما عندنا present simple continuous perfect continuous. باللغة الفرنسية عندنا 7 أنواع من البريزنت وعندنا 7 أنواع من الماضي. يعني عندنا الماضي الناقص الذي لا وجود له بالإنجليزي ولا بالعربي، عندنا الماضي السابق، عندنا الماضي التام، وعندنا الماضي البسيط، وعندنا الماضي القريب اللي هو near future near past. حقيقة هاي يثير لنا مشاكل كثيرة بالترجمة، يعني لعدم وجود الإكويفالنت باللغة العربية، ولهذا أصبح هنالك نوع من الاجتهاد خاصة من قبل الأساتذة اللبنانيين وأساتذة شمال أفريقيا بسبب تغلغل اللغة الفرنسية، وهذا حقيقة تاريخية. فهم من ترجموا مثلا لما نترجم المضارع اعتيادي عندنا يكتب وكتب وسوف أو سيكتب، احنا بنجي نترجم الحقيقة هذا مضارع وماضي ومستقبل، بس راح نواجه مشكلة أولا بالمضارع المستمر وبالماضي المستمر وهكذا. فوضعوا بعض الحقيقة خلينا نقول particles حتى نميز بين أنواع الماضي. يعني احنا عندنا الماضي البسيط هو كتب الدرس، كان ما نقول في اللغة الإنجليزية he wrote the lesson he wrote the letter. لكن لما نقول he was writing the letter مثل ما تفضلت قبل شوية بالمثال، قلت when المثال واضح، حضرتك قلت I was watching TV when my friend came أو when. الشيء أنه بالماضي المستمر وضعوا ما يعرف ب كان زائدا يكتب، يعني كان زائدا فعل مضارع، يعني بينما كان يكتب الدرس دخل أخيه أو دخل صديقه. في الماضي التام يكتب كان زائدا قد زائدا ماضي، كان قد كتب الدرس، يعني he had written the letter before he came to school. فهذه تثير لنا مشاكل كثيرة باللغة الحقيقة بالترجمة. أنا درست الترجمة أكثر من 38 سنة، ولكن الحقيقة الترجمة اللي هي الترجمة الفرنسية وليس الترجمة العربية الإنجليزية. بالنسبة أنا ألفت وترجمت أكثر من 17 كتاب في مجال الترجمة، وجنابكم الكريم ممكن تراجعون دار الكتب العلمية أنواع الترجمة: الدبلوماسية، السياسية، الترجمة الصحفية، الترجمة التعليمية، وأنواع أخرى. الحقيقة حوالي 17 كتاب، هذا فقط بأنواع الترجمة ومنها التعليمية، بالإضافة إلى طبعا ترجمة كتب وتأليف. عندي الحمد لله الآن تجاوزت الرقم 34 كتاب منشور. أحدهم هو في إنجلترا في لندن حول لارسا، الحقيقة هذا بالآثار بالأركيولوجي. هذا translated from Arabic into English by London Publication in London. وآخر عندي بالحقيقة عندي 6 كتب في الأمازون في الولايات المتحدة. ممكن حضراتكم تراجعون جوجل، تعطي الاسم كامل، راح يجي لك 6 كتب موجودة تباع في الأمازون بالولايات المتحدة. هي ليست دعاية لي حضراتكم أتحفتمنا بهذه المحاضرة القيمة.
شكرا.
وجهودكم مشكورة، وجهود أستاذنا ودكتور سلام محمود جامعة المثنى، والدكتور علي المناع تحمل أعباء السفر من قطر إلى العراق.
لا ما في سفر.
وأنا أشكركم الشكر الجزيل، وهذه فرصة طيبة أنه على الأقل تعرفنا على حضراتكم الكرام.
نشكر حضرتك دكتور على المشاركة ونشرف.
الله يبارك فيكم، يبارك فيكم.
يعني في الحقيقة لا تسمح لي أن أجيب باللغة العربية. يعني ذكر الدكتور حسيب، وأعتقد أستاذ الترجمة في جامعة الموصل،
نعم.
يعني كتب الدرس في الماضي. كان يكتب، صارت يعني past continuous، لكن ليس دائما. والدليل عندما ناقشت الجملتين كنت أشاهد، أو على سبيل المثال لنناقش جملة أخرى، كنت أدخن عندما وصل أبي من العمل. كنت أدخن هي past continuous when you activate the mechanism of equivalent search. لكن كنت أدخن عندما كنت صغيرا أيضا عندنا، لكن هذه الحقيقة ما نقدر نترجمها إلى past continuous. وبالتالي we failed to figure out the contextual tense. أحد الزملاء ذكر، أعتقد أو الزميلات ذكر أنه هل نستطيع، أحد الزملاء، هل نستطيع أن نعتمد اعتمادا كليا على الظروف؟ نعم نستطيع أن نعتمد. يعني عندما ندرس كنت قد ناقشت تذهب لهذا الزمن، لكن ليس دائما نستعمل هذه التراكيب في اللغة العربية أو الصيغ، وأيضا ليس دائما نترجم هذه التراكيب أو هذه الصيغ كما أسميتها أنت بنفس الزمن، ولكن علينا أن نأخذ السياق بنظر الاعتبار. شكرا جزيلا.
دكتور جنابكم الكريم، الحقيقة يعني كان الشرح، إذا تسمح لي أقول، ب3 محاور. يعني كان pragmatically وsemantically and contextually. أنا هكذا أشوف الشرح مع جنابك الكريم، وأنت مشكور جدا على كل ما تفضلت به. والشكر أيضا لأستاذي دكتور سلام.
شكرا حضرتك دكتور، شرفتنا بمشاركتك وتعليقك. شكرا.
يبارك فيكم.
نعم. It's time now for Dr. Hussein Ahwayel, please.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Salam, for these valuable webinars. Thank you for Dr. Almanna. It is a good opportunity to listen to your nice presentation. Doctor, you know the role of culture and translation. Is it possible to say that translating tenses is culture specific, or it is semantically universal? Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. I think من جامعة بابل وسابقا من الناصرية. شكرا جزيلا.
نعم
دكتور حسين, I don't think it is related to the culture. No, it is related to our language. This is our language, and we don't have a grammatical category for aspect, so it has nothing to do with the culture. Therefore, what we have to do, we have to discuss, I'm trying to discuss the problem by adopting a cognitive perspective. Why? Because I'm trying to develop an approach. So when I read, when I listen, when I read a sentence, I normally have a mental image. And normally people have full imaging systems. So in this presentation and in this article, I heavily relied on the first imaging system, which is called the configurational system, put forward by Talmi. But I have added a lot of categories to sort out this problem. Yes, of course, when we discuss examples, if you remember my own sentences, when I said have those sentences have the same grammatical form. Here we talk about grammar, we talk about structure, we talk about morphology and syntax. And also I said, and the same content specifications. Why? Because in cognitive linguistics, we normally rely on two dimensions, grammar and semantics. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Salam.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein, for raising this question, and thanks for Dr. Ali for answering this question. Now for Dr. Sameh Mohammed, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Professor Ali, thank you very much for this invaluable webinar and lecture. And thanks for all the organization committee for such a wonderful lecture. I am from Sohag University in Egypt, working in Saudi Arabia. Actually, I have a question regarding translating research articles. During my work as a proofreader or doing proofreading for English translation of Arabic research articles, I noticed that our researchers prefer to use when they write their abstracts or when they write their literature review citing studies or books, or when they write their research results, they prefer to use past simple tense or present perfect. While I go for using the historical present, I mean, when we say the research results show blah, 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 or this article presents or analyzes. And when we refer to a study in literature review, citing, for example, Dr. Ali المناع, for example, 2010, uses or discusses or things. This is my own, this is what I go for. Some professors or some people say we should use the past simple tense, especially in literature review, while others prefer using historical present. Actually, I go for the second point or the second argument, which is using historical present, because the action is not finished. As when we cite a book or when we cite a study, the study is there and the book is there and its effect is there. So what do you think, Prof? I mean, am I right? Or
Thank you, Dr. Sameh, for your question and also for attending this. Actually, we do have an agreement in this regard. So, but in my opinion, what is important is that you need to pay extra attention to what is called consistency. If you decide to use, let's say, the simple present, you have to carry on using the same tense. So I'd like you to change the tense. In the first example, you decide to use the simple present and then you jump using another tense, thus affecting the quality of the piece of research. I normally prefer to use the simple present tense. I normally go for, let's say, Talmi, holds, you see. But if I have a year, if I decide to start my own sentence by mentioning the year, let's say in 1988, comma, Talmi, here, because of the structure, I have to go for the past. Sometimes for the sake of the consistency, I have to change the structure, although I like it, you see? In terms of the past, when you talk the previous studies, sometimes we encourage people to go for the simple past in that section of the literature review. If you talk about the results, we do have an agreement, actually. Sometimes I go for the present perfect, sometimes I go for the simple present. Sometimes you have to take into consideration the journal itself. What do they prefer? The university, what do they prefer? And so on and so forth. Okay, but let me emphasize this point because thank you for your question. It is very important to pay extra attention to what is called consistency. Carry on using the same tense till you finish. But when you talk about data, let's say collection or data analysis, you might go for the past. Okay, this, let's say, list of questions were given to a number of students. Why? Because it occurred in the past. Thank you.
But what about literature review, Prof?
Yeah, I prefer, in the literature review, I prefer, but I don't have any problem if somebody asks me to change it, I will change it. But normally, personally, I prefer the simple present.
Historical present.
Yes, historical present.
Thank you.
But if you ask me as a proofreader, as editor, as let's say somebody who's working, taking care of my own writing, and you have the you have that power, you are in the driver's seat, I have to listen to you, and I will change it. But what is important? Consistency. I have to discuss it with the editor if they failed to live up to what is called consistency. I might draw their attention, but for the sake of consistency, I decided to use that tense. And they might say, I see, okay, thank you. So it is what? It is a discussion. Thank you. Even, let me add something, even in this chapter, I don't like that use, but it is used by well-known journals, by well-known publishers. In this chapter, I will discuss this and that. There is no need for I will. In this chapter, I discuss. Fair enough. So it depends. It depends on your style.
The problem lies in the Arabic researcher's mind that they translate literally. For example, أظهرت دراسة البحث أن كذا. So they literally translated into the research showed or found out.
Yeah, maybe because of our language. Maybe because of our language, because
but
we
here the
prefer
correct one. Yeah. The correct one is to the research shows or reveals that blah blah.
Yeah, we cannot say, to be honest with you, I have to be very accurate. We cannot say correct or wrong, but I would like to emphasize the consistency.
Yes, sure.
Consistency is a very important issue that should be given a front seat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sameh, and thank you, Dr. Almanna. Please, Dr. Ali, allow me to speak in Arabic
please.
for a couple of seconds. نرحب بالدكتور باسم خيري عميد كلية التربية والعلوم الانسانية في جامعة المثنى. يحب يرحب بحضرتك ويسلم عليك. تفضل دكتور باسم.
بارك الله. تفضل.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام دكتور باسم الغالي.
الأخوة الأعزاء جميعا ولا سيما الأخ العزيز الدكتور علي المناع. سعدتم مساء جميعا. بصراحة أنا كنت حاضرا من بداية المحاضرة لحد الآن. لا أدعي أنني فهمتها يعني كلها يعني لاختلاف التخصص، ولكن أود أن أشكر الدكتور علي المناع كثيرا وجزيلا على تلبيته لدعوة كلية التربية وقسم اللغة الإنجليزية في جامعة المثنى. كم كنا نود أن نستضيف الأخ العزيز الدكتور علي المناع حضوريا في رحاب جامعة المثنى، ولكن هذا الحضور الافتراضي يمهد إن شاء الله مستقبلا للحضور الفعلي والمادي. مرحبا بك وشكرا جزيلا لكم. هذه المحاضرة الإلكترونية أظن أنها تبين وتبرهن على مدى استعدادكم لنقل المعلومة مهما كانت الظروف ومهما كانت الأوضاع التي يمر بها العالم. شكرا لكل من سهر على إقامة هذه المحاضرة ورتب لكل الأوضاع، ولا سيما دكتور سلام الموسوي رئيس قسم اللغة الإنجليزية ودكتورة شذا الخزاعي. شكرا لكم، بارك الله بكم ونفع بعلمكم جميعا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
شكرا جزيلا لحضورك دكتور ولمشاركتك الدائمة ودعمك الدائم لكل الجهود المبذولة بكليتنا وقسمنا وباقي الأقسام خصوصا بهاي الظروف. شكرا جزيلا لحضرتك.
الله يبارك فيكم دكتور.
بارك الله فيكم. إذا تسمحوا لي دكتور سلام ودكتورة شذا أن أرحب بالسيد عميد كلية التربية، أعتقد اسم الكلية التربية في جامعة المثنى، وجامعة المثنى في مدينة السماوة جنوب العراق، من الجامعات التي نعتز بها. الحقيقة حضورك تشريف لهذه المحاضرة المتواضعة التي حاولنا تسليط الضوء فيها على مشكلة، إحدى المشاكل. والحقيقة أنا ذكرت ولكن باللغة الإنجليزية أن هذه المحاضرة بالذات تعني لي الكثير، لأننا رتبنا الدكتور سلام وأنا قبل سنتين الحقيقة أن تكون هنالك محاضرة حضورية وجها لوجه، ولكن حالة الحقيقة الظروف دون ذلك. لذلك عندما فاتحني الحقيقة دكتور سلام عباس الموسوي لم أتردد، يعني ولم أقل دعني أفكر، قلت تم، لأنني الحقيقة وعدتكم أن تكون هنالك محاضرة. الآن أنا أتمنى أن تزاح هذه الغمة وأن يكون لي حضور فعلي في جامعتي جامعة المثنى لأسهم بالقدر البسيط الذي أستطيع أن أسهم فيه. شكرا جزيلا دكتور باسم على ترحيبك، وشكرا جزيلا لجميع الحضور.
تشرفنا إن شاء الله بأقرب وقت. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا.
نشكرك دكتور باسم، ونشكر دكتور المناع. دكتور علي, sorry, do you have time or to have some more questions?
It's up to you. No, we cannot say we don't have time. We have time because they decided to attend, and they actually, I appreciate their own attendance. Therefore, we have to listen to them. We have to discuss whatever they have in their own mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, with Dr. Sousan Saleh, please, your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali Al-Manna. It was a very enlightening lecture. I won't take a lot of time. I just want to comment that I practice translating from Arabic into English, and I teach this to my students. Usually, when we translate a verb from Arabic into English, I advise my students to take it as a unit. We take the verb as a unit. In this unit, we have the subject, verb, object, along with the adverbials. I look at all these elements when I translate. The subject, whether I take into consideration collocation, gender, and number. With the object, also we take this into consideration, although gender is not that much important, but sometimes it refers to the plural when we translate, not only the singular, sometimes for certain bodies. And the adverbials. The adverbials are very essential when we translate the verb, considering that we have the continuous and the perfect tenses in English, which we don't have in Arabic, but we take them into consideration through the adverbials. Thank you very much, Dr. Ali, and thank you, Dr. Salam, for allowing us this opportunity.
Thank you. May I answer, please, Dr. Salam?
Yes, please, Dr.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sousan Saleh Saraya, من جامعة العراقية from the Iraqi University, I guess. Thank you for your question. Actually, this is what we try to emphasize. Instead of just concentrating on the verb or sometimes reading part of the sentence, you need to read everything. You need to read the whole sentence, and sometimes something before the sentence, context, which is part of the context. Thank you very much for your comment. Yes.
Yes, now it's time for Alia Ahmed, please.
Assalamu alaikum all.
Alaikum assalam.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Almanna, for this valuable webinar. I'm a senior translator, Alia Ahmed from University of Technology, and I would like you, if you could please give a simple explanation about using foreign sense with tenses and how rendering them into Arabic, translating them into Arabic.
So can you repeat, please? You need examples
or
to use what?
Using for and since, as we know that for we use for with the tense referred to the continuous, okay, continuous, present continuous, and since with the past tenses. If there any comment from you by using these with tenses and rendering them into Arabic?
No, actually, thank you, Ms. Alia, for this question. Okay. Actually, we don't have any problem with the use of for and since when we translate from from English to Arabic. If you don't have any reference to the past, you go, we cannot generalize again. Normally you go for the, for example, if you have a sentence like, I've been working in this company for many years. For 10 years. Okay.
Yeah.
So here, what is we have 2 points of emphasis. So we try to emphasize the period, plus we try to emphasize the continuity. So you need to reflect those 2 points of emphasis. Okay. So أعمل في هذه الشركة منذ سنوات. But if I go for عملت في هذه الشركة منذ سنوات, I failed to emphasize the second point of emphasis, which is continuity. عملت means what I have worked in this company.
Okay. And
so this is the problem. So I think we don't have any problem with translating from English to Arabic, but you need to back translate to see whether you have reflected all details or not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alia, for your question. Now with Mr. Mohammed Boghyan, I guess.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Ali Manna, for this enlightening webinar, and I was not lucky to attend from the very beginning of the webinar. First of all, I'd like just to introduce myself. This is Mohammed Boghyan, an assistant professor of applied linguistics and translation at Helwan University in Egypt and Taiba University in Saudi Arabia. Dr. Ali, I'd like just to ask about some questions regarding this. For example, the difference in translation between translating the past tense and the present perfect. So for example, when we are teaching our students how to translate, for example, an example like I translated and the example I have translated. So I'd like just to know your opinion in translating these 2 sentences in order to show our students how we do differentiate between such tenses, which are 2 different tenses from the past and the present perfect. This is the first question. I'd like to ask you about
I normally, sorry to interrupt here, sorry to cut in. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. I normally try to answer one by one, otherwise I'll forget the point. Yeah. So let me answer that question and then we move to the second question. First, thank you for attending. Actually, I'm not into encouraging people to use لقد. I think I'm trying to read what you have in your own mind. So ترجمت, both are correct. Normally, if you are working on that level, just I translated this text, I have translated this text means what you are working on sentences. Yes, we encourage students to try to use لقد. Okay, لقد ترجمت. But it doesn't make sense for me. But when it is part of the whole text, you might find a solution. by using a conjunction, by using whatever. This is the first question. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this, Doctor. I was just the issue was that when we tell our students that when we translate, we have to take care of these two different the different tenses. They are trying to see how we are going to translate such structures which are, let's say, intricacy, a bit fall translation, pitfalls, as you see. I have translated this text, I have translated this text, and if you are not going to use, for example, an emphatic structure like laqad or qad or whatever of this, so we might find it difficult to convince our students how this could be rendered into Arabic.
Yeah, thank you, Dr.
Anyway,
Mohammed.
just let me, that's fine.
Sorry, just let me comment on that. Yes, I mean, I have already told you that when you try to encourage your students to show the differences, they have to know the differences between the interfacing languages. Here, they have a grammatical category for aspect, but in Arabic, we don't have. Therefore, what is the solution? Sometimes we try to what? We try to insert some lexical items. And this is an example of what? Of level shift. If we borrow terms from Cartford, I think you are fully aware, you are in the loop about this. Okay, so you need what you need. I think we need, let me use we need to what? We need to emphasize the point that we have to take into consideration the differences. But when we try to translate just this short sentence, I think, yes, it is better to tell that one of the solutions is laqad, but it is not always,
I do agree that context is the most important thing in the, that's right, of course, but that's right, the context is the most important thing in the in any translation process. That's right. The second question, actually, the Professor Ali, and I really appreciate your writings because I read a lot for you. Thank you very much for everything that you are writing. The second question is regarding the translation of the active and passive between Arabic and English. And we know, of course, the passive in Arabic has many functions more than in English. So, for example, if we are translating something that is in Arabic, for example, حكمت المحكمة عليه بالسجن كذا كذا كذا. So here, it's this structure, حكمت المحكمة, it's very clear that this is active. When we translate it, we don't mention the word court in the English translation. So I need just to know your opinion about translating active into Arabic and passive into English and vice versa. Thank you,
Dr. Mohammed. Actually, again, this is, I mean, again and again, we have to give the differences between the two languages adequate consideration. In Arabic, we don't prefer the use of من قبل, من جانب, if the agent, if the actor, if the subject is known. So try to go for active. And when you go for active, although the sentence is the passive, and then again, you have an example of what? Of structure shift or an example of modulation. And this is, I mean, this is very normal when we translate. You will have a lot of examples. Normally, I advise people to try to avoid the use of passive in Arabic, in particular when you have that structure, من قبل or من جانب or من طرف, whatever. Try to go for the active if you have the agent, if you have the actor, if you have the subject. But if you don't have it, go for the passive. We don't have any problem. Okay, ضرب الولد. Why? Because we don't know. Okay, this is on the one hand. On the other hand, also we have to take into consideration the text type. So if you translate, let's say, a legislative text, and then you don't have a lot of freedom, you don't have that flexibility to reorder the components of the sentence. So we don't have any problem to use من قبل. Keep it passive and use من قبل only in that text type, which is legislative text, which is part of legal text. Thank you.
Okay. Doctor, in this point, I'd like just to shed light about something which is very important. Sometimes the English structures, they'd like to focus or to make an emphasis on the thing. For example, if they are doing the passive, for example, they are going to say, The Tempest is written by Shakespeare, for example. So here the focus is not on Shakespeare. The focus is on the art, which is the art. I mean, the book that is written by that writer. So the focus is not on the writer, it's on the. So when we do this shift, for example, if I'm going to say شكسبير كتب هذه القصة أو هذه الرواية أو هذه القصيدة. So in this way we changed the shift. We made a shift which is not intended by the writer or by the author. So this is what I mean. So it sometimes it makes a lot of
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. I mean, yes. You are talking about theme, Reed. You talk about that you try to emphasize something in English, but also because of the differences. I mean, if you feel as a translator, you have analyzed the text from different perspectives, and you feel that more emphasis is placed on that word, you have to find a solution. Again, what is your own translation? What is your own global strategy? Is it a reader-oriented translation? Are you going to live up to the target language readers' expectations, or no, the other way around, or something in between? Of course, it's not up to you as a translator, but you have to take into account what is called a translation brief, text type, readership, purpose of translation, and so on. So if your own translation is, let's say, a reader-oriented translation, in other words, you are going to leave the reader alone, to borrow terms from Schleiermacher, and you bring the author and the text to the reader. Here you have, I mean, a lot of freedom. You have a good degree of flexibility to deal with the text. You might go for what? Al-Kitabu. Why? Because you decided to emphasize the word Al-Kitabu. So instead of saying Al-Kitabu, الكتاب كتب من قبل شكسبير. This structure will strike the target language reader as unusual. But you decided from the beginning that you have to what? You have to live up to the expectations of the target language reader. Therefore, your own translation is not adequate. So what is the solution? And you feel that you want to emphasize the word al-book. You might go for what? A cleft structure, or a relative clause, al-kitab الذي كتبه Shakespeare, and linking that sentence to another sentence. So it's up to you. It depends on your own style. But sometimes you fail. Let's have an agreement that we failed. We tried to do our best, but we failed. And then you have to decide. I will go for what? كتب Shakespeare هذا الكتاب.
Okay.
So if I failed to emphasize the word al-kitab, and so on and so forth. Thank you for your contribution, Dr.
Thank you, and I'm not going to ask the third question, just to give our colleagues the chance to ask their questions. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, and thanks for Dr. Ali. Now with a final question from Shahad Adil, please.
Good evening, Doctor, and everyone.
Good evening.
Actually, I am a student, a third-year student at College of Education for Girls, Department of English. Actually, we have not studied translation yet. So, does the doctor have any advice for us to enhance our translation?
Thank you, Shahad. Yeah, I mean, the first step that you have to do, Shahad, is that you need to work hard on your linguistic competence, the most important one. And then you move to the act of translating. One of the pieces of advice that I would like to share with you is that try to read bilingual books. what I mean by bilingual books, when you have the source text and the target text. And I have my own books. The latest one is titled Modern Arabic Short Stories. And then you will have the source text and the target text together. And then you start about comparing, writing your own notes, etc., followed by exercises in that book. So at the moment, I would like to advise you to do that, in addition to spend a lot of time putting in a lot of energy to improve, I mean, your own skills, the 8 skills, not 4, because if you want to be a translator, you need to work on those 8 skills, 4 skills in the source language, let's assume it is Arabic, and 8 skills in English. If you feel that you are not good enough in Arabic, you need what? You need to start working on your own Arabic. Try to speak in standard Arabic. Try to take care of the al-fa'il, al-fi'l, al-i'rab to a certain degree. Otherwise, you cannot translate into Arabic. You will be criticized. Why? Because you don't have a good command in your own language. So you need to spend a lot of time on the linguistic competence before moving to the actual act of translating. Meanwhile, also you can have a look at the bilingual text. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I really appreciate your answer.
Thank you, Shahid, and thanks for Dr. Ali. I think we have another question, Doctor. Only one question.
My pleasure.
Okay, Mr. Zaman, please.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Dr. Ali Manna. Yes,
your name, please.
Dr. Ali Manna, I want to say something before my questions. Actually, your skill of making the subject matter interesting is quite remarkable, and honor my life to listen to your speech. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Manna. Doctor, I want to ask you about the rule of hermeneutics in the process of translation.
Again, please.
I want to hermeneutics.
Okay.
Hermeneutics rules in the process of translation. Yes. That's my question. Is there any rule for hermeneutics in the process of translation?
Yeah, it is not our topic tonight, but this approach is a philosophical approach. I mean, when you have to do your best as a translator to understand the first step that you have to do to understand, and then you are, if you feel that text is worth being translated, and then you start translating. So it is a philosophical approach, but it is somehow similar to the interpretive approach. So they normally emphasize the first step, which you have to understand the text. Otherwise, you're going to fail to translate. So it is. I mean, it is a huge topic that we cannot discuss it in just 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, but you can read about it.
Now I am diving in that subject in my research, in my thesis. So I ask you about the rule of hermeneutics and translation.
Yeah, they have 4 steps. I cannot remember all of them. I have already mentioned them in my own book, Translation Theories. But I do remember the first step, that you trust the text. This is their own approach. You trust the text, that you feel that it is worth being translated, and then you have to do your best to understand. And when you fail to understand, you have to rely on your own intuition, badihiyya. And then you attack, they use these terms, you attack the source or the source language, and you bring the source text to the target language. So they use that metaphor. I cannot remember, I have to be honest with you, I cannot remember all these terms for the moment, but I have already explained that approach in my own book, Translation Theories. Thank you for your question. Mr.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Zaman. Finally, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Dr. Almanna, for joining us in this session. And I'm really speechless about your generosity for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
On behalf of Al-Muthanna University and the Department of English, we'd like to thank you. And we hope that we see you again in Al-Muthanna. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me finish off this webinar, this particular webinar. I have already mentioned it is a dream come true for me because of many reasons. Actually, I'm proud of you, my dear colleagues in the English department at Al-Muthanna University, because you have done a great job. So please carry on the good work and never stop trying, and try to take your success, because you have achieved something, and that something for me, it is a high notch of achievement. So try to use it to achieve something else. So I'm sure that your success will take you to the highest of hope, to the windows of opportunities that are waiting for you with open arms. Hats off to you, my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for these nice words. And I'd like to thank everyone joined us today. Thank you very much and have a good night.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.